find the one and how you might go about sorting out your anxieties about that, the messages you receive from what you really want inwardly. And then part 2 was an underlying anxiety in so many of these letters. Well, what's it really like? I'm seeing scarcity. As a woman in my late 20s or 30s or early 40s or whenever, I am sensing that there are not a lot of men with whom I want to settle down. So we talked with Paul Oyer, the Stanford economist, about what the reality of the dating and marriage marketplace was. And I think you will agree, Cheryl, it was terrifying. We have not been able to recover from that experience.
Well, and that's, part of the reason that we decided to do this part 3 is this sense of despair. I felt, okay, we have to do another episode on this subject because, of course, Oyer's statistics are there, and yet what we know is people need to make their lives. They need to find happiness and joy in their lives, whether that be partnered or not. And so I wanted on this episode to look more deeply into a life without a partner, or at least an era without a partner, an idea of the self that doesn't revolve around those traditional expectations of marriage and the modern world. And so on this episode, we're going to explore a bit of that.
And of course, we have lots of letters that are in one way or another groping consciously or unconsciously with that possibility. So we should hear a couple of those.
I'll read the first one, and then why don't you just go ahead and read the second one? Dear Sugars, I'm someone that's always gone with my gut, and that has served me well for the most part in many facets of my life. Moving across the country, my career, dating men, and doing an around-the-world trip by myself. But over the last 4 years, I've been trying to find a life partner. No luck yet. I've dated men in that time frame, 2 of them for 9-month periods, but I never had that assured gut feeling with either of them. Now I'm nearing my 37th birthday. I see the pool of available men dwindle with each passing year, and all I need is one, my one. So why is it taking so long? Many of my friends have now attained this profound connection and started families of their own. Because of this, my network of supportive girlfriends is no longer there, as they're all busy with their new babies and full lives. I've sought counseling, both intuitive and professional, and most of the guidance I've received has been to love myself and not put so much pressure on a timeline. I feel I've made a genuine effort in this regard. I try to be gentle with myself, get out there and make eye contact and practice peace. But I'll soon be in my late 30s, sans husband. After years of this, I'm starting to lose faith, feel lost, and I'm genuinely lonely. I try to acknowledge gratitude and appreciate my wonderful life. But I have this love I want to share and receive in a romantic way, and not being able to give it or get it is making me frustrated. It makes me sad to think it just may not happen for me. Getting married, sharing a dog, creating a child. I want to do these things with a man I love, not simply settle. I recently read this quote from New York Times wedding columnist Lois Smith Brady. Whenever anyone asks me about love, I always say, wait for that feeling. Wait, wait, wait. Wait with the patience of a Buddhist fly fisherman. Well, I've waited, and I just don't know what to do anymore. I've dated intentionally, randomly, digitally, organically, and spent time single. I can say with certainty that I'm a good catch. But I'm starting to question if I'm relying too much on a notion of fate or that, quote, it just feels right feeling. At times, I wish I was a more logical type A person, but that doesn't seem authentic. How long should I wait? Am I being too picky or unrealistic? Should I simply suck it up and start a life with a good guy that I'm not in love with? Should I accept a disheartened future of spinsterhood? Lonely Buddhist fly fisherman.
Dear Sugars, I'm a 37-year-old single woman. That sentence by itself will likely conjure up all sorts of assumptions, many of which likely apply. I long for a family. I have a PhD and a great career. I'm 6 feet tall and blonde. I take care of my body, have good friends, and am socially and civically active. If you polled my former lovers and boyfriends, they'd tell you that I'm a passionate lover and caring partner, but somehow those relationships didn't work out. In short, we didn't fall in love. There are a couple of relationships in my late 20s that, in retrospect, I likely ended too early. But I was dealing with some pretty epic life shit at that time. Now that I'm getting older, I get fewer dates, and the men seem to have multiple great women to choose from. My biological clock is starting to get annoyingly loud in my own mind. I'm grappling with the idea that I may never be a mother, and while I don't feel desperate at the thought, I'm deeply grieved and sad about it. So what's the problem? I ask myself that question every day. Being alone in the world is the central sadness of my life, and I am so very tired of it. For so many men, I'm too tall, too educated, too accomplished, too old, too something. I'm doing everything I should do to change the situation, sugars. I'm dating online. I took a new job in a bigger city to enlarge my dating pool. I go to yoga. I have hobbies, but my heart is weary. The holidays were very lonely. My siblings are busy with their own children, and my friends were all out of town. I'm not sure how to keep hoping for love and family when it just doesn't seem to be happening for me. If you told me 10 years ago to choose between career and love, I would have chosen love without a second thought. Instead, all I have is career. How do I keep hoping every day? How do I find this thing I want more than anything? I'm so tired of being single in a world full of couples and families. Signed, Central Sadness.
Ugh, these poor women.
Right.
Both 37, which I think is important. I know, in both previous parts of this series, we've talked about how we get these letters from women from a wide range of ages, from 20s well into 50s. But I will say the largest number of them come from women in their late 30s, people who
Right.
are approaching 40 or right around 40. And I think it's no coincidence that both women mentioned wanting a partner, but also wanting children.
Right.
The stakes are really high for these women because their biological clocks, let's face it, they are ticking. There is going to be a time in the near future that they're not going to be able to have children biologically.
Mm-hmm. Or going to have to have intervention or run
Sure.
risks if they want to get pregnant. Right. The other thing that I felt is a very strong undercurrent in both of these letters, and particularly Central Sadness, but actually both of them, is the idea of that same thing we hear over and over, Cheryl. I am waiting for love. And what I would counsel both of these letter writers is to think less about what's happening in terms of your behaviors, because I think clearly they're doing the right things according to Paul Oyer, moving to a bigger city, trying to be patient with themselves and so forth, but to uncouple the process from the results that they want. There's a profound difference between being alone and being lonely. And
Yeah.
both of these letters are really saying, not just I'm alone, I am actively in a state of grieving that I am alone. I feel an absence rather than what we're going to hear, what you push for, and good on you for it, which is a conception of living on your own that is much more joyous, or at least fulfilled. And if, as a byproduct of that, you eventually find a man who you want to come to terms with or raise a family, wonderful. But even before that happens, I think we're troubled by the fact that they experience their own solitude as something that's really grief-stricken and an absence rather than a possibility.
So this is why for this episode, I really wanted to talk to Kate Bullock, who Lena Dunham mentioned in our conversation. She published in the Atlantic Monthly magazine, All the Single Ladies. It was this cover story, got a lot of attention. And out of that, Kate decided to write a book called Spinster, Making a Life of One's Own. It came out earlier this year. It's an absolutely fascinating book. It's a memoir about her experiences as a single woman, really intentionally. She's single and she's in her early 40s and she has made this life of her own. She also wrote deeply about 5 women in history who have been inspiring to her. Some of those women ultimately got married, but all of them define themselves. In some ways, Kate's reclaiming that word spinster. I'm just going to read you the opening paragraph. Whom to marry and when will it happen? These 2 questions define every woman's existence, regardless of where she was raised or what religion she does or doesn't practice. She may grow up to love women instead of men, or to decide she simply doesn't believe in marriage. No matter. These dual contingencies govern her until they're answered, even if the answers are nobody and never.
Mm-hmm.
Men have their own problems. This isn't one of them. I thought that was so interesting. She, in that paragraph, essentially sums up this thing that we talked about way back on episode 1 when we realized there were so many letters about this question and they were all from women.
Right.
And this thing, it's almost like every woman has to answer this question for herself.
Right.
It's almost like a rite of passage. And, most women do end up going the traditional path and partnering up.
Right.
And some don't.
And to be clear, and this is what I'm excited about in talking with her about the whole book, the problem isn't the question. The question is an inheritance. The problem is that we limit the answers. that we really, by our own consent and by cultural conformity, really limit the possible answers.
So let's give her a call and chat with her.
About joyous spinsterhood.
Yeah, joyous spinsterhood.
Hello.
Kate,
Hi there.
this is Cheryl Strait. How are you? I'm here with Steve Almond.
Hello. Nice to meet you, Steve Almond.
Hi.
Great to hear from you, Cheryl.
Nice to hear from you. I was just, Steve and I were just chatting before we dialed you up, and we mentioned you and I knew each other way back in our 20s.
Isn't that so cool? So I was 21 or 22.
You were 22, and I was 26. I just finished hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. I met you like a month after that.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes,
I love it.
I love it too. And what's funny is we had both just moved to Portland. Here we are, our lives circled around back to each other. And interestingly, I kind of always knew they would. And only because I remember the reason you left Portland is your mom became sick with cancer and died shortly thereafter.
Yep.
But I just want to say how moving I found Spinster, those parts of Spinster, and the legacy of your mom and your own life, your independent spinster life is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you so much. And I think it's neat to think about like this topic of what we're talking about today and about how lives turn out. I think even instance of our meeting and my not knowing what was about to happen is such a great example of life doesn't ever go the way that we expect it to be. So there I was at 22 and my mother was fine and I had no idea that she was about to die and that my life would change once she did.
Yeah.
It just fits into this theme about looking for love and marriage and what life throws at us.
Right. We never know when the good thing is about to happen or the bad thing.
Exactly.
We really don't. Now, in Spinster, Kate, you write about, you basically had two big relationships.
Yeah.
One in your 20s and one in your 30s. Obviously, others along the way. But, right, big loves where it was you who decided to end those relationships. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, the first big love was college. And we were together for 5 years. And I really loved him and his family. And my family loved him. And that was a mutual breakup. Like that was just like we finished college, a couple of years passed. My mother died. I was a wreck. He couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle it. And it was devastating to lose that relationship. So at that point, I didn't want to be alone. I just couldn't be with somebody. And then, like within a year, I then fell in love again. And I felt at this point, I had been thinking a lot about how I had never been alone and that it was something I needed to learn how to do, that I grew up in a very functional, stable, loving family. I was very close to my parents. I'm still very close with my father and my brother. I'd gone from one boyfriend to the next. I was just that kind of young serial monogamist type. And I was always being taken care of sort of by somebody. And so to lose my mother and go through this severity of grief that nobody else could understand, it feels so alienating and lonely making when you're going through it. But it also, that's what kind of helped make me see that I was the only one who could get myself better, who could get through this grief. That was going to be an individual process. And then I sort of enlarged that out to see that if I wanted to become the kind of mature adult that I wanted to become, I really had to learn how to be on my own and deal with everything on my own. And back when I was thinking that in my 20s, that felt very scary to me. That it felt weird that I was thinking that way. Like, why would I choose to be by myself? Especially when I'm in love with a really great person. This doesn't make any sense. So it was a very confusing time. And when we broke up, I just realized, I had to go do this. I had to go be by myself. And then the cute part is that I thought, I'll do that for a couple of years. I'll learn how to be on my own, and then I'll fall in love again, and I'll be a better partner. And instead, years and years passed. A whole decade passed. And during that time, I would fall in love and then feel that it wasn't the right thing for whatever reason, or that I still wasn't done figuring out how to be on my own, that process wasn't some neat little thing that could be wrapped up in 2 years, that in fact it was a lot messier and longer and lonelier and harder in a lot of ways, but also very exhilarating. And as time passed and I started to feel more the exhilarations of being alone, I started more and more to not want to give that up. So I went from being someone who wanted to learn how to be by herself to someone who really preferred being by herself.
Wow. So that brings me really to the questions that we had for you about these letters, because these are two women, lonely Buddhist fly fishermen in central sadness, who are experiencing as real sadness their loneliness. How did you react to these? What do you have to say?
Yeah, well, the letters broke my heart. I remember that feeling so well, and it's awful, that feeling. It just feels like it will never end, that kind of loneliness, and that everyone around you is happy and figured it out, and you're a monster. Or at least that's how I felt sometimes. Like, what's wrong with me? Am I some kind of monster? Why can't I get with the program or commit? Am I commitment phobic? Do I have female Peter Pan syndrome? What's going on? But the loneliness can be unbearable sometimes. But at 35, I really went through this transition, and I've seen it happen to other women too, and I've read about this. At 35 is a really seminal year where it's almost like I woke up one day and looked around and said, what am I so sad about? Like, my life is really great. And I just shifted my point of view. And I think it took a while to get there, but once that happened, I didn't feel the loneliness in the same way. And I also said to myself, wow, I didn't get married at the normal time. So this might never happen, or it might happen next week or in 10 years. Who knows? But the point is to not orient myself toward that, because by doing that, then I'm only focusing on what I don't have.
Right.
And instead, I need to focus on what I do have. And so once I did that, things really shifted for me, and I started to live more actively as a single person. For a while there just was like a learning curve, and then a lot of loneliness and watching friends get married. And then I started throwing myself into it more headlong and just enjoying it more and traveling more, like making my work make me travel. I also, just by the luck of my work being a journalist and given that assignment to look at contemporary marriage trends, that gave me the experience of really immersing myself in my contemporary context, and that gave me a sense of perspective that I found really consoling. When I realized that I was part of this massive demographic shift of more unmarried people than ever before, and that there were a lot of reasons contributing to that shift, I felt less lonely. Because one thing that's interesting about this rise of the single, quote unquote, is that it's happening all over the country, and actually the Western world for that matter. But like right now, for instance, the city with the most single people is Chicago, not New York City. I think we think it's New York City. Chicago has 36% of the population is single. New York City is 32%. LA is 28%. Dallas is 28%. So it's kind of like when you're single in your urban area, you're in a minority.
Right.
But then all of these little minorities add up. And that parallels a shift that I went through, that I felt in my social circle like the only unmarried person, because I was. And so as they all peeled off and got married and started having children, and I was, kind of left standing on my own,
Right.
For a while that was a lonely period. And then I started to make friends with other non-married people, and then this whole new world opened up to me. And so then being single didn't feel like an aberration. It just felt like a way that I happened to be living, and something that was the result of choices that I had made, that some were conscious and some were unconscious. And realizing that I had made these choices, even though I didn't understand them as choices at the time,
Right.
I felt more in possession of myself.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, Kate, it's encoded in the language, that sense that you're supposed to get with the program. And the program, of course, is sort of heteronormative marriage. Buddhist fly fisherman writes to us, I now feel the added weight of this lack because many of my friends have now attained this profound connection, as if it's something that they achieved, when in fact it was something they decided to enact in their lives. And I think unconsciously, especially for letter writers, our letter writers who are in their late 30s, there is this powerful sense that you look around and everybody else in your cohort is doing a certain thing, and it's a thing that the culture says that you're supposed to do, and it marks your sort of ultimate role and fulfillment, especially for women. And if they're not, then they become, in ways that are often unconscious, incredibly down on themselves and judgmental. I think everybody does this. It's this idea that Tim Creeder, the essayist calls this the referendum. As we reach a certain point in our lives, when we start to reflect on it, we look at everybody else and find in their experience something that we failed to achieve or attain or get a hold of. And this is especially powerful, it seems like, when it's something as fundamental as this idea that we're told from fairy tales on up that you're supposed to find the one and then settle down with them and have the 2.4 kids or whatever it is.
Yes, exactly. I wrote about 5 women in my book, and they all lived around the turn of the last century, and they are a mix of famous and obscure people. So they are the very obscure 19th century journalist Neith Boyce, Neith. She was named after an Egyptian goddess. The famous, iconic poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, who won the Pulitzer in 1923, I think. The novelist, also very famous, also Pulitzer Prize winning, Edith Wharton. The social activist and social visionary and writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who is most known for her short story that most of us read in high school or college, The Yellow Wallpaper,
Yes.
about her postpartum depression.
Mm-hmm.
And Maeve Brennan, who lived more mid-century, mid-20th century, who was an essayist and fiction writer and wrote under a pen name called The Long-Winded Lady for The New Yorker for many, many years. And at first I wasn't sure why I kept choosing women who lived at the turn of the last century. And the reason I did, it turns out, I learned through researching the book, was that the turn of the last century was a very optimistic and thriving time for unmarried women. There was a conversation around marriage and a critique of marriage. And women were entering the workforce in universities like never before, and there were more single women than ever before.
Right.
But what they had to help them was what I think of as the golden age of the great aunt or the aunt. So there were women, the first wave of the women's movement in the mid-1800s, a lot of those women remained unmarried, and they went on to not have children, but to have nieces who could then live by the examples of their aunts and great aunts. And that my generation didn't grow up with those great aunts because history turns and turns again. And when I was growing up, I didn't know any single women. I thought the only way to be an adult woman was to be married. And so I'm really excited to think about what all of the young girls and my nieces are seeing today, that they're seeing women living active, full lives on their own.
That's right.
And it shows them that that's a possibility. And for me, the reason I went and found those women to write about is because I wasn't seeing them in my contemporary moment. I didn't have models, so I had to go back to history to find models. Part of why I was doing that was because I couldn't have these conversations that I wanted to have about my life that I used to have with my mother. My mother was no longer around for me to have those conversations with her. I had to have them with other people. But then that meant I could choose who my mothers were, so to speak. I could choose people who had qualities or asked questions or approached life in a way that felt interesting to me.
I think writing about those women is so powerful, Kate. And I loved that part of the book. And I want to offer to lonely Buddhist fly fishermen and Central Sadness, those women as perhaps inspiring role models for a life that is less hinged on finding that one. Mm-hmm. And I think that a key point of your book, and also a key point of the kind of inspiration that we can give to listeners and these letter writers in particular, is to say, part of why you're suffering, on this show, we're always, one bit of advice I'm always giving is rewrite the story. And, obviously I'm not trying to convince people who want to get married out of that desire or dream, that's not my end goal. But on the other hand, it is powerful, I think, to think, well, maybe, like the process you went through was in some ways was rewriting that story. You always thought your life would end in marriage. And I love that really how with such clarity you write about your ultimate discovery that you feel most secure when you are not bonded with somebody else or depending on somebody else, but really when you've developed your own sense of self and independence.
Right.
You say that writing the book made you see the question you'd long posed to yourself, whether to be married or single, is a false binary. Mm-hmm. You write, the space in which I've always wanted to live, indeed where I spent my adulthood, isn't between these two poles of marriage or being single, but beyond it. The choice between being married versus single doesn't even belong in the 21st century. Can you talk a little more about that? Where is this space you're talking about?
Yeah, that it was the good life, right? That's what I was in pursuit of, was how to best live my life. And the only way I knew how to frame that was, well, when I find the right person, and everything will click into place. That was how I sort of set out on my life, with that assumption. It just was the natural order of things. And I lived inside of that binary, inside of my head all the time. I'm single. Oh, what a rotten week. I can't pay my rent. What am I going to do? Everything's awful. Why didn't I get married when I was 30?
Yep.
I've destroyed it. It was as if being married would solve everything. And instead, what was happening was I was living my life and getting stronger and learning how to be in the world and having great relationships with all kinds of different people and experiencing a lot. And so that's what I mean when I say that I was living life beyond this single versus married binary. But for a long time, I wasn't recognizing it as such because I was blinded by the binary.
Right.
And once I released myself from that binary, I was able to see that I was living my life exactly the way I wanted to be living it.
Right.
And that the reason I say I don't think that binary belongs in the 21st century is because we just don't need marriage the way that we once did. That's all. And, and that's part of what these demographic shifts are showing us. We all want love, or most people want love. It's one thing to say we don't need marriage, but a lot of people still want it. But what I mean is that because we don't need marriage, we are freed of certain ways of doing things that we actually weren't very free from in the past.
Right. And we've redefined marriage. I mean, even those of us who are married have marriages for different reasons and that serve different functions and purposes than really throughout almost all of history. So I think now when we talk about marriage, it really is, two fully whole, developed individuals who have decided to join their lives, and they depend on each other in certain ways, but not in the old ways where a woman, say, would be dependent financially on the man or, those sorts of things.
Right. And on the other side of it, as you guys were talking, I was thinking about the Germaine Greer quote. I am going to get it wrong, but she basically says, there are thousands of women who are staring at the back of their husband's newspapers or listening to him breathe at night who are lonelier than any spinster in a rented room.
Right.
We think of, especially you, lonely Buddhist fly fishermen, but all our letter writers are defining being single as a kind of enforced loneliness, and marriage somehow is the cure to loneliness, when any married person can tell you, especially I would say married women, that it is in many ways a new kind of loneliness. Yeah. I think there is this false idea that we carry around and is very hard to rid ourselves, that the thing that we don't have, in this case marriage, is going to be a cure for loneliness, when in fact I think it opens up a whole new portal to feelings of being lonely, entrapped, lacking the capacity to go off and do the things you want to do. You and Cheryl are exemplars of women who have constructed lives where you have tremendous, by dint of your own hard work and decisions you made that were very much interested in exploring the world because of a genuine curiosity about the world around you and the world inside you. You guys have a lot of latitude. I would warrant that most people in marriages do not have that kind of latitude. They are really, their lives become circumscribed by choice, and sometimes they have very happy lives, but man, I can draw a circle around what I can do now, and Erin can draw an even smaller circle, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to read a quote for you guys. Edith Wharton wrote this in a letter to a friend of hers, and it gets at exactly what you're talking about, which is, life has loneliness at every stage, no matter if we're coupled or single, and there's no cure. It's part of the human condition. It's part of what it means to be alive. Edith Wharton wrote in a letter to a friend, "I believe I know the only known cure, which is to make one center of life inside of oneself, not selfishly or excludingly, but with a kind of unassailable serenity, to decorate one's inner house so richly that one is content there, glad to welcome anyone who wants to come and stay, but happy all the same when one is inevitably alone."
Wow.
Great quote. And that's what you need to do no matter what you're doing.
Yeah.
A version of this actually is playing out, Kate, of what you've described. You can hear it in Lonely Buddhist Fly Fisherman's language. She writes, it makes me sad to think it just may not happen for me. And I think the point you're trying to make, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, is it is happening. You have to show up for your life. This is your one life. You have to be present for it and accept that it's not the life that you imagined it was going to be, or this expectation that's hanging over you is, if you continue to define your life as not meeting that expectation, you're doomed.
Yes.
Right. Ultimately, that's true in any case, whether it has to do with settling down and getting married or having kids or reaching a certain level, professional status or income bracket, whatever it is. When we define our lives by some expectation, not just of normalcy, but that magical realm where we're suddenly going to be happy, it's a fool's errand. It's just not how it works. But there is this question that is lingering, especially for central sadness, which is, she wants to have a family and she wants to have kids. Have you thought about that in your own life and in relation to this letter, this sort of third path that is an independent, happy, joyous spinsterhood?
Yeah, both letter writers mentioned it.
That's right.
Yeah, I just was one of those people who never felt strongly one way or the other. And that's a lot of people, actually. The majority of people aren't really sure. And then a small minority of people are totally certain they never want kids. And then there's a slightly larger grouping of people who know they definitely want kids. I fell in that vast middle. And I, along the way, decided, I guess I just don't feel strongly enough about this to force it to happen, which is what did seem like that was the only way it was going to happen at that time when I was thinking about it. And I decided that for me, it would either happen or it wouldn't. And then I had to confront it more closely because I was 40 and then 41, and as I would joke, I had 2 eggs left, and so I didn't want that decision to be made for me. I wanted to make the decision consciously, and so Cosmopolitan magazine asked me to write a story about would I have a baby on my own, and so in order to address that question, I interviewed 30 women who had decided to have babies by themselves, and there were fascinating interviews. One thing that was fascinating was how happy all of them were. I had assumed that it would be harder, but all of them, to a one, said, it is totally really hard, but it is so worth it because this is what I've always wanted.
Yeah.
And it was the force of their wanting that made me understand how happy they were and made me see that that was not something for me to do. I had never felt like I wanted it enough. Because that was the other thing. The advice that they would give to me was, don't do this unless this is absolutely what you want more than anything in the world because it's so hard.
Right.
But yeah, the rise of the choice mom is a really fascinating one. And, I love how it turns the notion of the spinster on its head because historically the spinster was barren and childless. And now we have single women who have their own children. And I would say that if you know deeply in every cell and all through your bones that you want a child more than anything else in the world, then if you're 37, you should seriously consider having a child on your own. And when I say seriously consider that, what I mean is really look at your life and see what your support systems are.
Right.
If you have enough money to do it, if your life is stable enough to support a child. And it was really eye-opening to me to see how many women have found happiness by separating childbearing from a romantic trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if that just seems inconceivable to you and you absolutely want to do it with someone else, then I think that there probably is some conscious compromising that takes place there. I really don't think any of us get everything we want in our lives. And if having a child is really, really, really what you want, and you really want to do it with someone, then really be open to every man you're meeting. Because it's very stressful. There's so much pressure when you're feeling the desire to have the baby, the pressure that brings to your dating life.
Oh, God,
is, very severe. And so it's hard, as I think it's important to kind of try to engineer runarounds around that so that you're not bringing all that weight to bear on the dating process itself.
Right, right.
One of the things that I was most struck by in your book is the way you write about your mother. I'm going to circle back to the beginning of the book, talks about the death of your mother. And in the end, you do circle back and write very movingly about how your mother, in so many ways, has been a source of strength and inspiration to you in this single life. And that is to say that you get to do things in your own life with your own independence that she didn't get to do for reasons having to do with generation and the shifting expectations of the times, and also the fact that she was your mother and she was your father's wife. And I really, as a mother myself and a motherless daughter as well, so many people say to me, oh, the legacy of your mother lives on in you mothering your children. And while that's true, I always think silently in my mind, where the legacy of my mother really lives on? It's in the big life I have in the areas of my life that have nothing to do with mothering. The independence and the traveling, adventuresome spirit that I had all through my 20s and still have. Some of the bold moves I made in my life with both my writing career and my romantic life and in every direction of my life. The way that we often conceive of our lives when we think, well, what should we do? We follow in the footsteps of the people who we know and admire. And this is in some ways why marriage has so easily perpetuated itself, right?
Mom.
Just like
Right.
when people think I've become like my mother once I became a mother. But what I am more interested in is part of bringing my mother into my life, for example, is, part of it is about mothering my kids. Sure. Part of it is about doing all of the things that she didn't have the opportunity to do by carrying her with me, in some ways fulfilling that legacy she couldn't fulfill because her life was cut short, because she lived in a different time than me, and and all of those things. And I wondered if you could speak to that in your own life, Kate, how your independence is connected to your mother and her life.
Oh gosh, so where should we start? First of all, I loved Wild, and I've loved all of your writing about your mother. And when I was writing my book, I was thinking about you a lot and talking to you inside of my head. And so I'm so glad that we're talking about this right now. So for me, yes, when my mother died, I felt thunderstruck by the idea that, life is so unfair. She was 52. She hadn't done what she wanted to do. She did what she was supposed to do, and she really fell in love with my father. She was happy with him. I know she was happy being a mother to my brother and me, but she had actively set aside her own ambitions, and that was a combination of not having the confidence to pursue them, but also not having any support, in her own family life or anything. She and my father met in their early 20s, and she was working full-time, and he was going to school full-time, and then they moved to Massachusetts, and he set up his little law firm. And one day she looked up and she said, wait, this is all there is? This is so much smaller than I imagined it to be. We achieved what we wanted, and it feels so small. And so it wasn't until her late 30s that she started pursuing what she wanted to be doing, which was writing. So she made a lot of headway, and she got cut down too short. She was really just hitting her stride when she got cancer again and then died. And so I felt, I know that I want to be a writer, and I know it's going to take me a long time to learn how to do it, and it's a hard business. And that's going to be my focus, because I want to achieve that for myself and for my mother, because she didn't get to. And so I definitely learned from her independent spirit, her curiosity, which I think is essential to being happy as a single person, actually, is the way in which curiosity brings you into the world and toward other people. And if you're not an innately curious person, maybe it's something to try and cultivate, because it's just like how kindness begets more kindness. I think that curiosity just expands and expands, and it really can fill up any loneliness because you're engaged with other people and ideas and experiences. But I definitely inherited my curiosity from my mother. I think that had she lived, she would be so happy with the life that I've made for myself, and that it was a fantasy of a life that she had for herself that she never got to live out. And, but that gets back to this kind of single married binary, because there is no one happy way. She had a lot of happiness that I will never have. I'm never going to have children. And so when I say I'm not having children, it's not a light decision at all. I think I am actively foregoing a source of great satisfaction and happiness, but it just does not work for the life that I have made for myself.
Well, Kate, it is such a joy and an honor to talk with you, and I think there are a whole bunch of people who are going to want to run out and get Spinster like yesterday. Because part of what you're doing here, which is incredibly valuable, is talking about your own experience and also finding new models. We have Central Sadness saying, I'm so tired of being single in a world full of couples and families. And the idea then, as you've done in Spinsters, to say, well, what other worlds are out there? And start exploring them, whether it's the world of Edith Wharton or Kate Bollock or Cheryl Strayed, whoever it is, that will relieve her of the anxiety anyway, that there is some exalted kingdom that she just hasn't been granted access to.
Kate, thank you so much. It was our great honor and pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be talking to you guys. I'm so pleased. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Did you ever find a place to believe?
Last Seen, a new podcast from WBUR and the Boston Globe, investigates the largest unsolved art heist in history.
So about the time that he begins putting the duct tape on, he says, this is a robbery.
The theft of $500 million worth of art from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston.
When the FBI says, we solved it, we know who did it, it's like, no, you don't, because you don't have the paintings.
Subscribe and listen to Last Scene now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Sponsored by Samuel Adams and ADT Smart Home.
I'm Michelle Goldberg.
I'm Ross Douthat.
And I'm David Leonhardt. We're the hosts of The Argument, a new podcast from the New York Times opinion section. These days, it's more important than ever to listen to people who disagree with you. Maybe they'll teach you something new, or maybe they'll just teach you how to beat them. So listen to The Argument from the New York Times. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to listen.
That was interesting.
It was fascinating. You know, one thing that was so moving, and I'm so glad you pushed her to talk a little bit more about her mother and that material in the book, because we really tend to overlook that daughters look up to their mothers, no matter what kind of relationship they have with their mother. If their mother's in their life, that is the person who they really look to as a model, and they're watching very carefully. It's so fascinating how that works. And for our letter writers, think about who your mom was and the life that she had when you were growing up and as you came into your adolescence and young adulthood and even now, and how that might be bearing on the way that you experience your own solitude as a punishment, as a sense of loneliness and so forth. It's so sad to hear that question at the end of Central Sadness's letter, should I accept a disheartened future of spinsterhood? And it was so, thank you, Cheryl, for bringing Kate Bolick on and replacing that or answering that question with, no, you shouldn't accept a disheartened future of spinsterhood.
And what Kate did was she redefined what that word spinster meant to her.
Right.
And I think that's really the best bit of advice I can offer anyone who is alone and who feels in despair about that is, again, to go back and revisit, what does it mean to be a spinster? It means to me to be independent and fulfilled, to be seeking, to be curious, to be thinking of life as the grand adventure it is. You know, our letter writers aren't to be blamed for not coming to that naturally, because every fairy tale, every woman in every fairy tale ends with the prince getting down on his knee.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But, you know, in Wild, one of the most important parts for me of that story was I saw that ending as something like the anti-fairy tale.
Yeah.
Because I finished my dark journey. I went into the dark woods like many fairy tale heroines before
Red
me have
Riding
gone.
Hood, yep.
And interestingly enough, so many women in fairy tales are motherless. They've lost their mother. They don't have that guiding star in their lives.
Right.
And they go on a dark journey. And in every fairy tale, what happens is the Prince Charming saves them. And I was really conscious when I was writing Wild that there wasn't going to be any Prince Charming at the end of my journey.
Right.
And, you know, in my life, I did go on and get married, but I had first to get right with myself.
Right.
And to find that happiness within myself.
That's right, yeah. We didn't expect this would go 3 episodes, but I think once we got in there, we were orienting it or canting it towards the outcome of finding the one, when in fact we should say, actually, you're the one. What if you're the one? What if the person you're waiting to show up for in your life is a version of yourself who's okay being alone? Mm-hmm. It's not